disclaimers first. Well, three, I guess. I don't have any financial disclosures, sadly. But two actual disclaimers. I'm not a physician. So if I get the medicine wrong, don't fight me on it. I'll believe you and it won't be useful. So, but like, I do what I can. And I'm also not a lawyer, and I'm definitely not your lawyer. So please don't treat anything I say as legal advice. All right, so I want to start with an example just to get us a little bit on the same page, although I'm sure you all have examples from your own experience. So I'd like you to imagine a woman who's experiencing nausea, lightheadedness, and back pain, and she goes to the emergency department. And instead of being seen immediately by a doctor, she enters her symptoms into a hospital-developed emergency department triage app that uses an AI algorithm. And it looks at her symptoms and it says, well, you probably don't have anything serious. You should go home and rest. And she does that. Later on, she visits the hospital again, and it reveals that she was, at the time, suffering a heart attack. She has suffered permanent heart damage. So we learned some things later about the algorithm. It does a good job triaging in general. It increases care efficiency. It's overall right more often than the rushed and harried doctors who work in the emergency department at that hospital. It's opaque. We're not sure quite how it works. And it was trained on a data set that was made up of about 76% men. And in case you don't know, the classic left arm pain heart attack symptoms are much, much more prevalent in men than in women. And in women, the symptoms that our patient mentioned are more often indicative of a heart attack. So the question is, how does and how should the law treat this type of situation? Who is likely to be liable, who should be liable, and how can we prevent this kind of thing from happening while still getting the benefits of medical AI? And I will be honest that from my point of view, I am thinking about liability. So you can think about liability in lots of ways as doing a good job of making people whole who are healed as a nasty thing that people have to suffer who are trying their best in good careers, or as a system that tries to set the incentives right so that good things happen more and bad things happen less. I am thinking of this principally from the last view. So I recognize that some of you may be thinking about this from the risk management view. Some of you may be thinking about this, I'm injured and I want to be made whole view. I'm happy to talk about those, and those are involved here. But the place I'm starting from is how does and should liability work as a way of having AI work well and not cause patients injury in the first place? Of course, there's a huge role for law in this and in other ways in bringing AI safely and effectively into medical practice. All right, so brief view, and I will actually bring in a couple things that aren't strictly liability into this talk as we see how the pieces fit together. So I'm going to start by talking about just brief overview of the problems in AI and the need for law to help fix them. Why do we need law interfering here at all? Talk about tort liability, the way it looks now and the problems with that and how a better system might look. Then I'll switch gears a little bit and talk about other forms of governance, how else we might try to make sure that AI is working well and safely, a little bit about how that looks now and problems with it, and then think about kind of future directions, how policymakers can help, particularly focusing on information. Before jumping in, I want to offer thanks to some folks. This draws on work with Sarah Gerke and Glenn Cohen for the liability stuff, Mark Sendak, Suresh Balu, and Karandeep Singh on some of the governance stuff, Artie Rai about information, and Anna Bracic and Shaniqua Collier about bias. I'm happy to drop or share the links to all of that work and other work with the organizers afterwards. One last note. This is probably going to be unsatisfying. You are not going to leave here with a ton of clear answers. Yes, this is exactly how it works, largely because the field is really developing and pretty muddled. But hopefully it will be interesting and worthwhile. So a little bit of background. I really just want to say, I think it's important to kind of divvy up what kind of AI we're thinking about in medicine. There are lots of ways you can divvy it up by how it's working or what systems it is, or if it's dermatology, or whether it's white box or black box or gray box or whatever. The one that makes sense to me is to think about what sorts of roles AI might perform in potentially transforming the health system for the better. And so I think of four big potential roles. The first is pushing frontiers, doing stuff that no human physician can do today, like, predicting acute kidney injury 24 hours in advance, that like no one can do, or spotting, pixel level indications of very, very early stage cancer. Incredibly cool, very sexy front page stuff that no one can do. Then there's democratizing expertise, which is to say, giving people capabilities that they otherwise might not have had, but that are certainly available within medical practice. So letting general practitioners do things that otherwise you would need a specialist to do. The kind of AI version of upskilling and democratizing expertise, in particular to places with fewer resources and fewer experts. I think of the third as automating drudgery. This is trying to deal with all of the paperwork and the tasks that clinicians just hate to do and are such a huge contributor to burnout. Ambient scribes are probably the clearest example of this, but I also think here about some back office functions like trying to deal with insurance appeals. And then the last is allocating resources, saying in situations of medical scarcity, how do we make sure that resources are effectively allocated? This one obviously has tons of ethically really challenging issues. Who gets that last bed in the hospital? Who's most likely to benefit from it? When do we staff people? When do we not staff people? Ethically super knotty. The law actually doesn't have quite as much to say about that just yet, at least not as far as I'm aware. So I'm going to focus in this talk mostly on the first two, pushing frontiers and democratizing expertise, the kind of things that are directly about clinical care, but I'm happy to chat about more things in the Q&A as well. So the problem from our perspective, there are lots of them, but the obvious ones are to think about kind of quality control and about bias. So for, quality control, there are tons and tons of examples. Easy ones include, sepsis predictors that it turns out don't do a good job of predicting sepsis. I love the example of the sepsis predictor that had as one of his inputs the ordering of antibiotics. That's just delightful. Clearly, it's not doing what we want it to do if it is using the output of the clinical process from clinicians as part of the input into this predictor. But it was sold as this is why it's so good, or part of why, and that was not why it's so good, but sold as a good product. We also have issues with bias. These show up all the time. The classic example, of course, is the United Healthcare story with Ziada Obermeyer's group finding that there was this is goodness, 6 years ago now, when assigning a care coordinator to try to coordinate the care for complex patients. Well, it turns out it's hard to code complexity, or at least it used to be hard to code complexity. And so use the totally reasonable proxy of price, not how complex is this patient's care needs, but rather how much did this patient cost in the past, which again seems fairly reasonable, especially if you're an insurer developing this. But they neglected to think about the fact that it turns out that Black patients typically are not treated as well by the medical system, and it spends much less on them, and so developed a profoundly biased predictor of how risky these patients were likely to be and how likely they were to need a care coordinator. But we see issues of bias all over the place in terms of where the data come from, who's represented in those data, who does the training, and for whom these products are implemented. And then I think we combine them in a problem that I think about a lot, which is just the challenge of generalizability and big variation based on context. So I tend to think about this as contextual bias, the issue where we've got lots and lots of data still coming from relatively few places. And there are very different patient populations and patterns of care and data structures across healthcare environments, both geographically and in terms of patient populations, and in terms of what resources they have to bear and what care patterns look like. So, Duke's Sepsis Watch product works super well if you have a team of crisis nurses who can respond to sepsis alerts. If you don't have that sort of dedicated team, it's much more likely that you'll have alert fatigue and much less effective responses to that otherwise very useful product. So these products sometimes they just break when you take them to another place. Sometimes they just perform badly. Sometimes it's the worst, which is that they perform badly for some groups and not other groups, and you don't notice it happening. So they can increase bias and increase inequity in patient care, or they work poorly, but in a way that's also not recorded because we're not great at recording how well things tend to work. Um, Lots of these things can result in patient error, not always obvious, not always observed. So, how do we deal with these problems of quality? Sidestep, why doesn't the market fix it? Honestly, it's the same reason, except more so that the market doesn't fix lots of problems in healthcare. These things are credence goods. We trust, we go into the hospital, we're sick, we leave, we're well. Did the hospital make us well? Yeah, we hope so. Sometimes it's pretty clear, like if the hospital cuts something out. But if it's just I was sick with something and now I'm better, I hope they healed me. But maybe they didn't. Maybe I would have gotten better faster if I hadn't gone to the hospital. Maybe I would have gotten better at exactly the same speed. Maybe I would have gotten better slow. Tough to know. So that's true of healthcare goods generally. And for AI, with the opacity of algorithms, with the challenge of actually tracing down predictions, it's going to be often quite hard to know what's going on and to trace these issues. So the market really does a pretty poor job of trying to evaluate quality. And so the way the law tries to step in here is two different big approaches. One is ex ante, that's regulation and governance and saying, hey, make sure this works before you can use it. And the other is tort and liability, which is ex post to say, hey, this thing went poorly. We're going to exact some sort of cost for it in the hopes that that will set the ex ante incentives right and people will get it right on the front end. So I'm going to talk lots about torts because, well, that's what we said we were going to talk about. So this is the classic way of trying to get behavior right up front and compensate ex ante. What this looks like, patient injured, and they sue, and the three big entities that are likely suable are clinicians, hospitals, and the providers or developers of the products, the AI systems. For doctors, this is just basically medical malpractice. It's just another form of malpractice. Now, the challenge with this is the rule for medical malpractice is did you provide care that was below the standard of care, which is what depending on the state, a reasonable doctor or a minimally competent doctor would have done in that instance. And if the physician should have done something under that standard, it does not matter what the algorithm recommended or didn't recommend. So if the standard of care for this woman was give her an anticoagulant and admit her, then you should have done that. If it was send her home, you should have done that. And it really doesn't matter what the algorithm says, at least not under current law. Maybe that will change, but not yet. And so this comes with a couple of challenges, right? One of the challenges is it incentivizes physicians not to actually use AI to do different things. If there's something they would have done before, because that's how they were trained, or that's what they think of as the normal thing to do, or that's what they think of as the safe thing to do, the fact that the algorithm says something different doesn't make much of a difference from the liability perspective. And if they do the different thing instead, now they're opened up in the same way that they might have worried before about doing something outside the standard of care. It's not like the algorithm said it was a good idea is a defense to malpractice. Again, it might be someday, but it's not yet. This also means it's tough if we think physicians are at the kind of pointy end of the stick. They're not exactly in a position to be evaluating algorithms to say, oh, is this good? Is this useful? Is this successful? That's just not part of how liability imagines physicians as part of this role. Again, at least not yet. So, okay, physicians, one person to possibly sue. Another is to sue the device manufacturer under a product liability framework to say, hey, you made this thing and it's defective. You should have made it better. And I'm going to sue you because you made an AI system that did not work well. Again, challenging. So far, courts are quite reluctant to call software products as opposed to services, which makes it harder to find liability. It's hard to know exactly what and where the error was in the causal chain. It's especially hard to know if where the error came from, if this is a piece of software that works well where it's initially developed and ends up not working well where it's eventually deployed, right? You can say, yes, this is a thing that works. Here is all our evidence that worked, and showing specifically the causal connection that says, here is why and how it didn't work in this particular instance in a way that was negligent for the manufacturer or falls under other doctrines of strict liability. That's going to be hard to do. The third form of liability that we look at is, or the third place to sue is to sue the hospital. So most traditionally, the way you sue hospitals, and this is still the case in most states, is you sue the hospital through the physician, or rather, because they're responsible for what the physician did, either because the physician's an employee of the hospital and you're responsible for things your employees did, or because they're an actual agent, meaning you controlled what the physicians did, even if they weren't your employee, or because a reasonable patient would have believed the physician was an agent or an employee of the hospital and you didn't disabuse them of that notion. So the old version is to say, or the more traditional and still quite widespread version is to say, hey, hospital, you're liable for some of the things that some of the physicians working within your walls do. In a few states, they're shifting to a direct duty of hospitals to patients. And there we might imagine ways to say, oh, here's how this should apply to AI as well. For instance, the duty to provide adequate equipment. Maybe we can analogize to that and say, well, that also includes a duty to make sure your AI systems work well or that you select them with due care. We haven't had any cases saying that yet. To be clear, we haven't had any cases on any of this yet. This is all a blank slate from the perspective of what courts are going to do. I'm talking about the case law as it exists, but that's not about AI. Not yet, anyway. So the default hook here, like the place that it seems most likely to find liability, is with the physician. And all of the groups that are saying things like, hey, the physician's always responsible, the buck stops with the physician, are indeed kind of working along with this vision that the physician is the final decider. But this creates some potential problems, right? As I mentioned earlier, relying on the standard of care, like what you actually hold the physician liable for, incentivizes docs to keep doing what they would have already done, makes it harder to see the gains from adopting, leaves value on the floor for when AI says, no, no, you should really treat this patient a little bit differently. Going back to the four roles for transformation, if we're talking about something like superhuman performance, if we're pushing frontiers and doing something that no physician can yet do, what does it mean to call what an individual doctor does with that information malpractice, when by definition, no doctor could have done exactly the thing that the AI did? If we're talking about democratizing expertise, the other place that I see a huge potential benefit for clinical care in AI, right? Not just, oh, here's an extra check, but let's do stuff you couldn't do before. Again, how do we think about medical malpractice in that context? Because by definition, they can't do the thing, right? That's what democratizing expertise lets us do. It lets us use AI to say, do something you couldn't do before. But again, by construction, that means you couldn't do it before. So how does liability, or how can liability in that instance help make sure that the AI is going to do the right thing? And how is it going to help us avoid these problems, these quality control issues that I mentioned earlier? And finally, how much are we asking doctors to do here, right? FDA guidance on clinical decision support software, for instance, says, doctors should know enough to know how the algorithms were built, what data were used for them, what the biases are, how well they perform. That's a huge amount of weight to put onto the shoulders of physicians with harried lives and less time than ideal. Okay, so lots of problems. One possibility to try to resolve these on the tort side of things, and this is work I've done with Glenn Cohen, is to think about enterprise liability, essentially say, rather than have all of these potential places that could be liable, let's try to centralize it in the place that's most likely to be effective. So a classic question to ask here is kind of, who is the cheapest cost avoider? Who is it that can actually do something to avoid these problems? And there, especially with contextual bias, it's pretty challenging. There's an information problem. Some actors have some information, some actors have other information, and it's tough to lump it all together. So the hospital or the health system typically is going to know the local variation. They're running the show. Sometimes states say they have duties directly to the patient. They're doing the last mile, actually providing the care. They know what's happening right there. The developer, on the other hand, they know the product really well. They developed the product, they know the data it was trained on, but they don't know the hospital and the local context and the last mile. So, one way of thinking about doing this is to say, well, which way is it easier to transfer information? And there we might say, let's allocate liability to the hospital. They're in charge of the last mile. That's what that patient expects. That's what that patient expects to be providing high quality care. They have the opportunity to monitor what's going on in that instance. The hospital can potentially tweak it or fix it. Now, of course, all of this depends on the idea that they actually know enough about the product to be able to tweak and monitor and fix it. And it all depends on them having the capacity to monitor and tweak and fix it. So maybe we set this as a default and say, hey, developers, if they're not sharing that information, we'll place liability back on them. Now, the handy thing, if you've been following government developments, the HTI-1 transparency rule, part of what it's looking to do is to require developers to share exactly this sort of information or some of this information with hospitals and health systems so that they can have a better job figuring out, does this work in my particular context? Can I be assured that this works well for my patients? All right. But all of this really hard. Maybe torts isn't the right place to deal with this at all. Maybe we should turn to regulation or governance instead. So I'm going to spend a moment talking about that, and then we'll come back. So when we think about governance normally or regulation, normally we think about FDA, right? There are normal regulation of medical technology. They're doing a lot of really neat things. They have cleared over 1,000 products and approved a few of them. Now, I am setting aside the fact that a bunch of FDA's digital health initiative just got laid off and that everything going on in the future is deeply, deeply uncertain. So I'm going to pretend that I'm just talking about FDA of a few months ago and, crossing hands that it will continue to do good work. So even assuming FDA is doing a great job of regulating everything at a central level, what does it see? There are tons of AI products that are developed and used in-house by academic medical systems or other high-resource hospitals that, frankly, FDA doesn't see. Whether this is because of the 21st Century Cures Act, because they're treated like laboratory-developed tests, because they just fly under the radar, because health systems don't fully know what their obligations are. There's lots of stuff FDA doesn't see. The boundaries of what FDA should see are unclear. They're still developing. There are still fights over FDA's 2022 guidance saying, hey, we want to see a lot more stuff. But even for the things that pass through FDA, we come back to those challenges of centralized governance, right? AI varies a lot by context. And that's not saying it always will or it always does. There are some products where the developers do a great job of making sure, hey, this is something that's really not going to vary by context. This doesn't depend on workflow. Whether or not someone's eye demonstrates they have retinopathy is something where we can use the same camera everywhere. We can use the same system everywhere. We can show that this works the same everywhere. Context doesn't matter. But for so many things, context is going to matter a lot when we look at deterioration or infection or patient flow or lots of tasks. When we look at workflow integration, where this is happening is going to matter a lot for how well the AI works. And that, frankly, is something that FDA just can't do. At least it certainly can't do it yet. So we add to that the idea that, well, we need some sort of distributed governance and or collaborative governance. This is something I've talked about with Mark Sendak and Suresh Balu. What does it look like? It's intense. It requires a lot. At Duke, they measure outcomes, look at performance and improvement targets, retrospective data validation, training, prospective study consideration for integration, have a whole team of people with different expertise moving into this. At Michigan, there's a clinical informatics committee with representations from a ton of different specialties that ask a bunch of the same questions. NYU does the whole thing as an in-house unit with a ton of IT. This takes a ton of work and a lot of resources, and it requires a lot of continuing evaluation. But here's the fun thing. Those tasks, the tasks of how can we do distributed governance and make sure that something is working ex ante, and how do we monitor systems to make sure that they're working well in the moment, and how do we evaluate failures ex post to figure out what went wrong and how we fix that? All of those tasks are very, very similar between the tort context. What is it that hospitals need to do to avoid liability, both for themselves and for their physicians, and the ex ante regulatory governance contexts? These things are deeply linked. And so then we ask, how do we facilitate this? How is it that FDA can help provide guidance for this? Will entities like OCHIN in evaluating systems and helping people choose what's right for them be able to help? Health AI partnerships, helping people develop the local infrastructure and figure out how to evaluate systems on their own end. All of these are the kind of efforts that are likely both to help on the tort front and to help on the ex ante governance front, because of course the two of those things are linked. This requires a lot of building capacity, knowledge of how to evaluate, building and developing best practices, technical infrastructure, IT systems, and people knowledge, thinking about how to share high quality data sets for training. Hi, Chai. Yes, I see you there doing good things in that space as well, at least potentially, and evaluating things at a kind of a regional or national system so that we have some evidence to put into this local hopper. And then on the legal side, ways to facilitate data sharing and interoperability and transparency. So how does this all cash out? Like, how do all these pieces actually work out exactly like one after the other? I wish I had an answer. How is the tort system going to evolve in the next 5, 10 years as we eventually see injuries really showing up? I don't know. Uh, I think there's a lot of exciting potential to make this really good. And I'm excited about the possibility of how we think about, from a policy, from a legal, from an infrastructure, from an implementation perspective, of making sure that AI works safely enough that we can implement it in lots of places and make healthcare better for a ton of people and not just for a relatively small set of well-resourced environments. All right, I'll stop there and I look forward to your questions and thoughts.
Nicholson, thank you for the incredible discussion. And we will, I do want to at least ask one question, and I see a hand, and this is something I've been watching in the chat. So this will touch on a few of the questions in the chat, and then we'll go to you, Alex. But Nicholson, I want to, can you speak to how regulatory pathway interacts with liability? So if I'm building a product, at least the common narrative, I may feel more protected if I take my product through regulatory clearance. And I may think, okay, well, that means it's been reviewed, it's been determined that this is safe and effective. How does that actually change the liability for the developer?
Yeah, so great question. Oh no, I just fell into the trap where I said great question. Now I have to say great question for all the questions, or you'll think I don't mean it's not a great question. Let's assume that I view all questions to be great questions. This one is. So, it's funny. People think that going through FDA actually does kind of immunize you from liability. And it can, but it almost never actually does for AI. Here's why. You might think, hey, I took it through FDA and therefore I did a good job. I made this product. I did a good job with this product. It's safe. It's effective. Stop bothering me. Don't sue me in tort law. And in fact, there is an explicit preemption provision in the medical devices amendments that says, these preempt state laws to the contrary. And so you can't argue if FDA has said this is a safe and effective product, if FDA has evaluated something and said it's safe and effective, as a plaintiff, you don't get to bring a tort lawsuit and say, no, it isn't, because FDA already gave the definitive answer. But there's a trick, which is that FDA only says something is safe and effective if you take it through pre-market approval. If you get a product approved by FDA, congratulations. You win a get out of jail free card for most state tort lawsuits because FDA has looked at it, has evaluated it, and said, yep, safe and effective. We don't get to disagree at the state level. But that does not hold true for 510(k) clearances. For those of you who aren't, I'm not going to take a poll. For those of you who aren't familiar, 510(k) clearances are the way like 99% of medical devices get onto the market now. Rather than saying, this is a product that is safe and effective, look, it's a new thing, I've done my clinical trials, I've demonstrated all of these things. In a 510(k), you say, this is equivalent to an existing marketed product. You submit much less information, and FDA says, yes, it's equivalent, looks fine to us, go for it. The Supreme Court has held that does not count as FDA saying this is a safe and effective product, and therefore it does not provide immunity from state tort lawsuits. Now, of the 1,000 AI products that have gone onto market after FDA review, I think, or a few over 1,000, I think maybe half dozen have gone through approval. The vast majority have gone through 510(k) clearance. A few, maybe a score or so, have gone through what's known as the de novo classification process, where FDA says, all right, we've looked at this. It's not equivalent to something else, but it's not that risky. Go ahead. I don't know of any court decision that has said what the standard is with regard to tort immunity for de novo products, but my guess is that they're much more like 510(k)s than there are like pre-market approval. My guess is that there won't be immunity for those products, but I don't know that for sure.
Alex, I saw that you took down your hand. Did you still want to ask a question?
I do.
Go for it.
Oh, thanks. Well, it's a comment. So, the total product life cycle draft guidance from the FDA has a section on monitoring. And I'm almost sure it's for all pre-submissions. And so if you could speak to that, it seems at least that's the current thinking of the FDA, which hopefully reflects the current thinking of many experts in the field. And it looks like they're saying going forward, they expect you to submit a marketing plan. And I just checked it out again in your risk management section. And so the FDA can require surveillance, and I think that's more for the high-risk devices, but it's very interesting that they take that more conservative approach for AI and say for all AI-enabled devices that we look at, we expect you to have a monitoring plan and a reporting structure and all that stuff. So that's relatively new and perhaps can have quite an impact. And I think it's super interesting that perhaps they didn't require it for the 1,000. Maybe they did, but I don't think I've seen it in many 510(k) summaries that we have a monitoring plan and this is what we're going to do. I have other comments about that, but if you could speak to that, that would be pretty interesting.
Alex, can you also introduce yourself? Because I know we have a very diverse group here. So as people ask questions, if you could just say where you're coming from and what your role is.
Yeah, so my name is Alex Friedman, and I have 5 years experience with software as a medical device, regulatory support, with an expertise in the gray area of what is and is not a medical device. 3 years experience specifically with clinical decision support, software development. Currently, I'm consulting and looking for opportunities. That's where I am now.
Cool. So look, I'll say a couple of things. First, I'm excited by the TPLC requirement of monitoring. I think that this is unavoidably and excitingly an important part of making sure that these systems work well, and that, I mean, even if it's perfectly instantiated, like there's gonna be data set drift, there's gonna be all sorts of other drifts. So like these things, like it's not one and done for AI. They need to be implemented and monitored in an ongoing fashion. So I'm excited by that. I have questions as to how it's going to be implemented and enforced um, along a couple of dimensions. One of them is a kind of depressing background, which is that um, post-marketing requirements typically have a pretty spotty record of enforcement at FDA, right? Phase 4 trials often don't get done. Um, like adverse event reporting is not great. Um, this is something that FDA is clearly like working on. The Sentinel Initiative is a great example of that. But the real touch point is approval. Now, I think it's I think it is hopefully like given that this is a feature that is being demanded of approval or clearance, um, I'm hopeful that that planning makes a substantial difference. I have no idea what kind of teeth the agency is thinking about applying to these requirements. It is also possible, it strikes me as very possible that given the idea of, predetermined change control plans and the idea that developers will have to continue interacting with the agency, that this monitoring will be more salient. So I'm hopeful, but I want to be a little bit cautious about that optimism given the past practice of post-market surveillance and monitoring. The other thing I'll say, just in terms of kind of how this is going to work in practice, is again, like I think it requires, like the question is who has the information and who is actually enabled to do this sort of monitoring well, right? So if like this is a plan that is imposed on the developer, which makes total sense, like that's where FDA has leverage, so it makes a ton of sense. Um, it's going to be really hard to monitor outcomes and performance um, at a bunch of different sites of use that have their own different data systems and workflows, right? Health systems have varying degrees of actually monitoring outcomes and how well things are working in practice on their own. And that variation depends on their resources and how much they prioritize it. It's not like there's a plug and play where you can just say, oh, yeah, it got it right all of these times because the algorithm was making the prediction and then watched all of the things happen and evaluated on its own whether it was successful, right? This is going to require quite a bit of engagement from the health system. And as I mentioned, that's an area where capacities and interest vary quite a lot.
Yeah, I have a quick comment on that. I was I think at the RAPS meeting, Regulatory Affairs Professional Society, and someone suggested that your clinical trials include a period of monitoring. So you let the FDA know we're going to get our clearance, but our clinical trial continues another 6 months, a year, and then that'll be our first round of monitoring, which I don't know how common that is. I mean, first of all, 510Ks, only about 10% of them require clinical trials to begin with. And then to add that, I mean, it sounds great, but I'm not sure how many business people want to make that investment. So, like you say, if they start putting up a halt on 510Ks until somebody says, until you show, well, my clinical trial will continue and I'll get back to you, it just seems tough. It's a very, as you said, I think it's a very, very hard problem. There was one solution, but easier said than done.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is absolutely 100% where we need to go, right? Like I'm not saying like the necessary, like the specifically monitoring in the context of a clinical trial is where we like that's the silver bullet here, but some form of monitoring and performance evaluation that is ongoing and that is actually usable across different contexts is definitely the desired end state. What that requires in terms of IT and EHR infrastructure and integration and like cultural shift to say, hey, we got to be good about figuring out how well this stuff is working and recording it. That's going to require a bunch of changes, but that's got to be the end state that we're working towards.
So I see another question from Krishnan. Um, if you can introduce yourself and then, yeah, take it away.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks. Great discussion. I'm Krishna Narasimhan. I'm the chair of the Department of Family Medicine at Stanford Health in Connecticut, also the designated institutional official for GME. And we have an AI innovation lab where we're sort of focused on the physician technology interface and kind of attitudes and perspectives in defining that. So my question, Nicholson, great presentation, but one specific area you touched on a little bit is, we keep looking at a lot of the AI tools as sort of discrete things that we can study. But my worry is that we're a little bit past that with a lot of institutional deployments. And so, for example, if it's already sort of like, let's say you get a solution where it's packaged in with the EHR, right? Much like, our phones, right? They already have, with each iOS update, right? You've already got it built in. Where does liability fall then on between the sort of institutional to, let's say, individual practitioner liability space, right? Because you can't take it out separately. So that's what I'm sort of struggling with if it's, sort of all over. Uh, how can you separate it out and have these kind of discussions that we're having? I feel like we might be a little bit past that. So I'd love your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So, I mean, first off, I'll say there's not I can't tell you, oh, yes, the court addressed this in this particular case. Or a court addressed it. Here's a particular answer. Um, the way that this is most likely to come up, right? The most typical and easiest entree into the liability system is patient gets injured because something happened in their care or patient gets injured, and let's presume something happened in their care that was wrong, that was below the standard of care, and they're going to sue the doctor for what the doctor or the clinician for what they ended up actually doing at the sharp end of the stick in terms of performing a procedure, not performing it, giving a diagnosis, not giving the diagnosis, prescribing something, prescribing the wrong thing, whatever it is that's actually the action. And at least for now, right, the fact that you can say, oh man, that error was reliant on an electronic health record recommendation that's built into the system, and it just did a bad job. That's not yet, um, that's not yet anything like a blanket shield. Now, two caveats to that, right? One caveat is someday it might be. There's a really provocative study by Nealon and Stramitzer, looking at how mock jurors would treat physicians who are accused of liability, and the AI told them the wrong thing to do. And what they found is that in mock jurors, there's something of a protective effect. And jurors are like, oh, actually, we think the AI told me the wrong thing should be something of a defense. Now, it's not recognized that way at law yet, so like a judge might throw it out before it gets to a juror, or the law might change to get there. But at least like some jurors think, or some prospective jurors think, oh, actually that is a reason to let the clinician off the hook. The other potential caveat to this is, right, there are ways that you can frame the medical decision, or that you can imagine framing the medical decision differently. So, right, one way to frame it is a woman comes in presenting with these symptoms, and instead of giving her anticoagulants and admitting her, you sent her home. That was not the right decision. The right decision, you should have done the other thing. A different way of looking at this decision is kind of, here is the situation. You're presented with somebody, and here is the information provided by an electronic health record. What would a reasonable physician have done given that information? And maybe the answer then is a reasonable physician would have followed through or would have treated something differently or whatever. Now, again, I have not, like these cases haven't shown up, so I haven't seen that argument being made. There are like vague analogies you can draw. I'm trying to actually remember. There's a case about like a mistake in a textbook that a physician relied on. I'm pretty sure the physician was still liable for that. So if you could still know the right answer, I think it's going to be tough to argue, well, but I didn't double check. Um, so to some extent, I think your question is like absolutely key. Like, how should we be thinking about this? How do we get at who actually made the mistake? And also, I think that the way the legal system is currently set up to some extent sidesteps that issue and just says, who is it that made the decision that was at the pointy end of the care stick? And was that a reasonable decision for them to have made at that time? Unsatisfying, I suspect, but it's the best I got.
Nicholson, I have one follow-up before we
Yeah.
go to David. I have not been following the case closely, but I know that there is a lawsuit against United Health for use of AI and rejecting claims. And I know that to your point, Krishnan, one of the first things you have to know is like that AI even had a role. When these things are just there, like patients may have brought this lawsuit years ago, like, but we needed reporting to expose the role of AI. But Nicholson, do you know how is United versus, I forget what the name of the algorithm developer was, versus like the product developer? How are they situated in that lawsuit where there are claims of harm from a decision made by an algorithm?
Oh man. It's been a while since I've not checked in on that again. If I recall correctly, I think it was actually this is like a contract claim, not a tort claim.
Hmm.
Like you didn't pay us the benefits that we were owed, but I wouldn't swear to that. Part of the problem here, and this is a little bit in the tort weeds, is ERISA. So ERISA basically says, in case you didn't know this, here is a fun and super, super horrifying fact about how the law thinks about liability that I will share with you now. Um, if you get your health insurance from your employer, um, and your health insurer says, I'm sorry, no, you can't have this procedure. And that was a wrongful denial. And you get deeply injured as a result of that wrongful denial. You know, you didn't get your leg treated, and so you got gangrene and they had to cut it off. Um, you are entitled, if you win, which you probably won't, you can sue them for denying you wrongfully. If you win, what you're entitled to is the amount of the original care. You don't get any consequential damages. Anything for now I don't have a leg. I suffered a whole lot. My wife left me. Everything is awful now. Here are terrible things that happened because of your totally wrongful decision. The law says, sorry, no, what you get is the cost of the initial treatment and nothing more. So, in this particular situation, I honestly don't remember the details. If it's an ERISA lawsuit, if this is United Healthcare operating employer benefit plan or employee benefit plans, then it's got to be just about contract, and it can't be any of these tort aspects.
David, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm Dave McSwain. I'm the Chief Medical Informatics Officer for UNC Health. And I apologize, I got on a little bit late, so hopefully this isn't touching on things that have already been discussed. But I wanted to touch on the discussion around kind of follow-up monitoring and evaluation. My background, I started out in the telehealth space, been working in there for well over a decade, and had a lot of discussions around research and kind of vendor engagement in that space. And there's always been a pushback around that responsibility for evaluation by technology vendors. And it's understandable, right? I think we're really entering a new paradigm, though, when it comes to AI, because it is difficult to tease out the aspects of clinical care from technology development and ongoing monitoring, algorithmic drift, and all of that. And you hear companies saying, well, it's really complicated. You got to deal with data interoperability. You got to how do you incorporate this into your processes? How do we figure out what the right questions to ask are? How do we make it applicable across multiple different institutions? And yeah, I mean, welcome to our world. This is exactly what we've been dealing with for years. And there is a responsibility on the part of vendors. There absolutely should be a responsibility on the part of vendors to partner with their customers, with the institutions that are providing this care, because now that we're getting into AI, we are starting to genuinely get into the space where the technology is contributing to the medical decision making, or very soon will be. And that is a new area. It changes the paradigm. We have to shift our thinking on this, and we have to shift the thinking around the vendor's responsibility. And that goes to the evaluation, the monitoring, the policy, and I think the liability. I think it is a new world, and we have to stop thinking of it in old terms. So just wanted to make that comment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. The I'll point out like two aspects of that I find interesting, and I think you're totally right that this is certainly the paradigm we need to be in. One aspect of this that's interesting is just the locus of oversight is really different for these entities, right? So FDA can say you need to have a monitoring plan, but FDA doesn't get to say a thing about UNC Health, right? They don't get to say what you do or what you can't do. They can't make you do anything. It's also the case that, right, like the entities that have oversight over you don't have any oversight over device managers. Like the Joint Commission can't say anything to Epic in particular, or at least they don't have direct oversight. So yes, there needs to be collaboration. There is no kind of single entity that can demand that collaboration. Now we can imagine like interesting things that aren't about based on demanding that collaboration just by fiat, but we can imagine CMS, for instance, tying reimbursement models, which both sides of this are likely to care about towards demonstration of collaborative monitoring and oversight. No, that's not what CMS is normally doing in the like, hey, develop a new algorithm space. But as Mark's written about, right, this is something that CMS does in other contexts of trying to demonstrate quality. So we can imagine that like there's a different locus to try to make this coordination happen, because really no entity can do it all on its own. The other thing that I'll mention to this is just this is another place where the resource constraints and resource differentials strike me as just absolutely crucial here, right? So UNC or Duke or Michigan saying, yeah, I'm going to partner with Epic or whichever particular vendor I'm talking about to make sure that it's working in my systems, and I've got the data scientists and the health IT folks to work on that interoperability concern, make sure we're measuring things, make sure we're figuring it out. Like that's a doable thing. If you ask, the community health center down the street, like that's wildly outside the capability, which is part, again, of why I think it's so important to think about developing tools to make this much easier and to make those hurdles much, much easier to jump.
So I think we have time for one last question, Edmund.
Yeah, great. So my background's from the medical device side, primarily diagnostic tools, which have included some machine learning algorithms. I do see that in a lot of the current technology, the AI algorithms are supposed to be adaptive after deployment. So that you've touched on the challenges with monitoring. Has there been any case law suggesting how to handle confidentiality? I remember way back when we were looking at developing assay panels, there are some very significant suits that came forward about people's tissue samples being used to develop tests without their permission. Aren't we doing the same thing with AI outcomes if we're consuming biologic data?
Yeah. So short answer is, oh man, there have been some high profile cases about initial training. So the Google Ascension case was the kind of highest profile version of that. University of Chicago case about like developers partnering with health systems to get the data to train their AI in the first instance. Those cases, to the best of my recollection, haven't ended up actually being particularly successful. Um, and I don't know that I expect that to be any different. Now, you can ask the ethical question. You say, oh, as a matter of ethics, is this something that we should be doing? How much active patient buy-in do we need? What is okay? Like, what do we count within our consent? From the legal perspective, right, to the extent that you're getting broad consents for the sharing of data, which is happening all the time, to the extent that you are de-identifying things, at least within the HIPAA provisions, like, there's not a whole lot of legal hook there. So yeah, I don't see it being a huge issue, but I could be surprised.
So
Thank you.
I want to thank everybody. We're 1 minute over. Nicholson, such a pleasure to have you. Really appreciate everybody taking an hour out to have this conversation. We'll be posting things online and welcome you to future events as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.